In 1962, the United States military formally proposed killing American citizens on American soil and blaming it on a foreign government. This was not a fringe idea floated by a rogue officer. It was a signed, typed, official document submitted to the Secretary of Defense by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The document was called Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It was dated March 13, 1962. The men who signed it were not criminals in the conventional sense. They were generals, decorated, institutionally respected, operating entirely within their chain of command. What they proposed was this: manufacture a series of violent incidents, stage attacks on American military installations, sink boats carrying Cuban refugees in the waters off Florida, detonate bombs in American cities, hijack aircraft. Then present all of it to the American public as the work of Fidel Castro's government. Use the manufactured outrage to justify an invasion of Cuba. This is what historians and intelligence analysts now call a false flag operation. The term comes from the naval practice of flying an enemy's flag to deceive a target before attack. The concept is not new. What made Operation Northwoods different, what makes it worth examining beyond the geopolitical footnote it is usually reduced to, is not the tactics, it is the psychology that produced them. Because when you read this document carefully, you are not looking at evidence of evil. You are looking at evidence of something far more ordinary. You are looking at what institutional authority does to human moral reasoning when the stakes feel high enough. And that mechanism is not confined to 1962. It is not confined to generals. It operates in every room where a group of people with shared goals and shared language are asked to solve a problem that has been framed as a matter of survival. But this goes further than most people realize. The document did not appear from nowhere. It emerged from a specific psychological environment, constructed over years, that made its contents feel not only reasonable, but necessary to the men who wrote it. Understanding that environment is how you begin to understand why institutions, any institution, are capable of proposals like this one. In 1961, the year before the Northwoods memo was drafted, Stanley Milgram at Yale University was running an experiment that would become one of the most cited studies in the history of social psychology. Milgram told participants they were helping to study the effects of punishment on learning. He told them to administer electric shocks of increasing voltage to a person in the next room whenever that person gave a wrong answer. The shocks went up in increments, marked on the dial: slight, moderate, strong, very strong, intense, extreme, severe, and finally, at the top, a label that read simply, XXX. The person in the next room was an actor. No shocks were real. But the participants did not know that. 65% of participants administered what they believed to be the maximum voltage, 450 volts, to an unresponsive, apparently unconscious person because a researcher in a white coat told them to continue. The researcher did not threaten them. He did not offer money. He said 4 phrases, rotating. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no responsibility for what happens. That last phrase is the one that matters here. You have no responsibility for what happens. Milgram did not interpret his results as evidence that his participants were sadists or psychopaths. He called what he observed the agentic state, a psychological condition in which a person transfers the sense of moral agency upward to an authority figure. They stop asking, "Is this right?" They start asking, "Is this sanctioned?" The generals who drafted Operation Northwoods were not in a basement in New Haven. They were in the Pentagon. Their authority structure was the most formalized on Earth. Their goal, preventing Soviet military expansion into the Western Hemisphere, had been defined at the highest levels of government as an existential national priority. Within that frame, the question they were answering was not, should we kill American civilians? The question, as they understood it, was what level of force is required to produce the outcome that has already been determined necessary. The transfer of moral agency had already happened before a single word was typed. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. This is not a failure unique to military institutions. Leon Festinger, the social psychologist who developed cognitive dissonance theory in 1957, observed that when people are embedded in systems with strong ideological coherence, where the goals, the language, the social rewards, and the punishments all point in the same direction, the capacity for independent moral evaluation does not simply weaken, it is actively suppressed by the organism itself. The brain experiences internal consistency as safety. Contradiction feels like threat, so you eliminate the contradiction, not the behavior that produced it. The generals did not experience themselves as proposing mass murder. They experienced themselves as generating options.
That reframing, options, not atrocities, is the central mechanism at work in the Northwoods document. Every item in it is written in the flat, bureaucratic language of military planning. Not blow up a drone aircraft in a way that mimics a Cuban attack, but a provocation carefully coordinated by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The language removes the actor from the act. When no one performs an atrocity, no one is responsible for it. They are simply executing a plan. This is where the surface explanation misses something. Most people who encounter Operation Northwoods treat it as an anomaly, a moment of Cold War madness.
A Pentagon that had been pushed to the edge by the Bay of Pigs failure, which had, in April of 1961, humiliated the United States on the world stage, and was now overreaching in desperation. That framing is comfortable. It places the document in a sealed historical container. But the Bay of Pigs failure did not produce Northwoods. It accelerated a process that was already underway. The psychological infrastructure that made Northwoods possible, the agentic state, the language of options, the moral outsourcing to authority, was not created by the pressure of 1962. It was created by the architecture of the institution itself, which had been built precisely to make those mechanisms reliable. Robert Cialdini, whose work on influence remains the most systematically researched in the field, identified what he called the principle of social proof, the tendency of individuals to determine appropriate behavior by observing what others around them are doing. In a room full of generals who are all treating the question of staging civilian deaths as a legitimate operational matter, the individual who objects is not only professionally isolated, he is cognitively isolated. He cannot find a behavioral signal around him that validates his discomfort. The discomfort becomes evidence of his own weakness, rather than evidence that something is wrong. No one in that room needed to be ordered to comply. They only needed to be in the room. President John F. Kennedy rejected the proposal. The document was classified and filed. It would not become publicly known until nearly 4 decades later, when journalist James Bamford uncovered it during research for his 2001 book on the National Security Agency. Bamford called it the most corrupt plan ever created by the U.S. government. Kennedy's rejection is worth pausing on. Not because it makes the story comfortable, it does not, but because it illuminates the specific condition under which the agentic state breaks down. Kennedy was not embedded in the same institutional logic as the Joint Chiefs. He was above it, structurally, but more importantly, he was outside its language. He did not share the frame through which the options had been generated. What the generals presented as a planning document, Kennedy read as a list of crimes. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the early 1950s showed that individuals consistently gave wrong answers to simple perceptual questions when everyone else in the room gave the same wrong answer. The conformity rate dropped dramatically when even one other person in the room gave the correct answer. One dissenting voice was enough to reactivate independent perception. Kennedy was that voice. But Kennedy's presence in that position was not guaranteed by any feature of the system. It was contingent. A different president, one more embedded in the institutional logic, one more convinced by the existential framing of the Cuba problem, might have signed it. And if he had signed it, American citizens would have been killed by their own government, while their government broadcast their deaths as an act of war committed by a foreign power. The machinery was complete. The operational planning existed. The institutional authorization was prepared. The only thing that did not exist was the signature of one man who happened to sit outside the frame. That is a very small margin. That single contingency, one person, one decision, one institutional outsider, is the gap between a planning document and a massacre. It says something precise about how institutions fail.
It is not the presence of bad actors that creates catastrophic proposals. It is the absence of anyone positioned to perceive the proposal from outside the logic that produced it. This goes further than most people realize, because the Northwoods proposal was not an isolated artifact of Cold War paranoia. It was one node in a documented pattern of institutional behavior that ran through the same period. In 1953, the CIA's MK-Ultra program began administering LSD and other substances to unwitting subjects, including American citizens, as part of what the agency framed internally as research into psychological vulnerability. Project Artichoke, which preceded MK-Ultra by 2 years, explored the use of hypnosis, drugs, and isolation to force confessions from unwilling subjects. The institutionalization of harm against the governed was not an accident in these programs. It was a feature, produced by the same psychological architecture: the agentic state, the language of necessity, the framing of atrocity as operational planning. What Northwoods makes visible, what its declassified pages make impossible to theorize away, is that the capacity for institutional violence against a population does not require malice at the individual level.
It requires only a sufficiently strong institutional frame and a sufficiently effective transfer of moral agency upward through the chain of authority. The men who wrote that document almost certainly loved their country. That is not a paradox. That is the mechanism. Philip Zimbardo, whose 1971 Stanford prison experiment demonstrated how rapidly ordinary people adopt the behaviors assigned to institutional roles, called this the Lucifer effect, the transformation of good people into agents of harm, not through corruption of character, but through the corruption of context. The role defines the behavior. The institution defines the role. The person inside the institution is, in a very precise sense, the last thing that matters. Zimbardo's study was shut down after 6 days because the harm to participants was accelerating beyond what the researchers had anticipated. But the institutional logic Zimbardo created in that basement, the uniforms, the titles, the rules, the language that separated guards from prisoners, produced the same psychology in graduate students that the Pentagon produced in generals. The uniform is not a metaphor, it is a mechanism. It tells the wearer what behavior is expected, and the wearer's nervous system responds. The Northwoods document is what happens when the uniform has been on long enough that the person inside it can no longer find the boundary between their own values and the institution's goals. Now turn the lens. You have never been a general. You have never signed a memo proposing violence against civilians. But you have been inside a frame that made a harmful action feel like a necessary option. You know this is true because you have done it, not in a Pentagon briefing room. In a meeting where everyone agreed on something you privately found wrong, and you said nothing because the social cost of dissent felt higher than the cost of silence. In a workplace where the institutional language reframed a decision that hurt people as an efficiency measure, and you used that language because it was available and because everyone around you was using it. In a relationship where the logic of the dynamic, the shared frame you had both built, made a behavior feel justified that, described plainly to an outsider, would have sounded like something else entirely. The agentic state is not a condition that requires authority figures in uniforms. It requires only a frame strong enough to make alternative perceptions feel illegitimate. And you have built those frames yourself. The institution does not always come from outside. When you rationalize a decision by saying, "I had no choice," or "that was just how it worked," or "everyone was doing the same thing," you are using Milgram's language, not his subject's language, his experimenter's language. You have heard yourself say, The situation required it. That is the agentic state, functioning exactly as designed. The uncomfortable question is not whether you are capable of producing a Northwoods-style document under the right institutional conditions. The research says you are. The uncomfortable question is what frame you are already inside right now that is producing the same function at a smaller scale. Because the generals in 1962 were not aware they were in a frame. They experienced themselves as thinking clearly. They experienced themselves as problem solvers, operating under legitimate authority, generating necessary options in a time of genuine danger. That is precisely how the frame feels from inside it. Here is what the research gives you that is actually usable. The diagnostic for institutional capture, the point at which your moral reasoning has been outsourced to the frame, is linguistic. It is not found in what you decide. It is found in how you describe the decision to yourself. When the language you use to describe a decision to yourself is the institution's language rather than plain language, the transfer has occurred. We had to restructure instead of we fired people who needed the work. Enhanced interrogation instead of pain. Collateral damage instead of civilians who died. Generating options instead of planning attacks. The gap between institutional language and plain language is the measure of moral distance traveled. This is not a prescription for permanent dissent. Institutions serve real functions. Coordination requires shared language. The point is narrower than that. The point is that the specific moment when plain language becomes unavailable to you, when you can no longer describe your actions in terms a child would recognize as accurate, is the moment the Northwoods mechanism is active. In you, at whatever scale your life operates at. Kennedy had access to plain language. He read the document from outside the frame that produced it. That outsider position was not wisdom, it was a structural accident. He happened to be positioned where the institutional language had not yet colonized his perception of what he was reading. The surgical tool is this: find the plain language version. Force yourself to state what is actually happening in words that carry no institutional load. If you can do it, you are not fully inside the frame yet. If the plain language version feels wrong, if it feels like a distortion, like naivety, like a misreading of how things actually work, then you are already inside it. I am not suggesting you will always choose to act on what the plain language reveals. That is a separate question, and it depends on circumstances that are yours, not mine. But knowing the difference between institutional language and plain language, and knowing which one you are using at any given moment, is the only cognitive instrument that functions as a check against the mechanism this document exposed. Kennedy did not sign Northwoods. That is the historical record, and it is true, and it matters. But there is a version of that morning in March 1962 in which a man reads a document, recognizes the plain language underneath the institutional one, and still signs it, because the frame is coherent, the stakes feel real, and there is no one in the room generating a different signal. The document does not tell you what humanity is capable of under extreme conditions. It tells you what ordinary institutional psychology produces under ordinary institutional conditions. The signature that was never added to that page is not proof of the system's resilience. It is proof of how close the system came. If this kind of clinical decode is what you came for, the channel goes deeper every week. Subscribe. The question the document leaves open is not whether a government can propose to kill its own citizens. It already answered that. The question it leaves open is what you would have said if you had been in the room, and whether you would have been able to find the plain language version, or whether, by then, it would already have been too late.